this session and the two to come might be very departing from what we have discussed so far. Not in that anything will be really unknown or unthought of, just in the tone and the way we are dealing with the subject. We call it this way, the architecting systems for future, so that we can indicate what we are really up to, what we want to do. Change is one thing. Change will come. Transformation is one way of looking at things per se. There is also another way to look at it, that change, whatever happens, happens in its own way if we put the right system in place. So theorizing that is what we are trying to discuss. So probably break it down into 3 sessions. So the first one, probably we want to mostly introduce the approach, what we want to do and how we have been thinking through. The second one, going into the details of some of the concepts that we have so far developed and the method in more detail. The third will try to identify some problem spaces where we can illustrate how this is going to look like. So that is the sequence that we have thought through. So we can, I can go through these, or feel free to interrupt and ask any questions or comments as we go through. So today's session, these are the main things we want to go over. So what is the backdrop? Why the backdrop is important is basically it sets the tone and the level of discourse. So external worldwide, if we see, no, there has been a continuous evolution in one part of the world, whereas there has been evolutions followed by revolutions in another part of the world, largely over the last 2 millennia if we take. But in the immediate past, we can see that decolonizing of a lot of countries has happened in 20th century. The 21st century, what we can expect really is the countries that are going to rise. Naturally, they will have the craving to assert their own identity, not just their power in the world, which means they are going to assert their ways of life also, not just their economic or political power. Which means that the natural corollary is they are going to start defining their own models of how to govern and their own definition of the purpose of life and so on. And this will be in a way conflicting to what we currently have, primarily because what we have seen so far, the default models that dominate the current world are inspired by the Enlightenment ideal for the large part. Although there are models that exist outside of it, Enlightenment ideal has been the dominant inspiring force for most of the models that dominate the world today. And most of the powers that have dominated used those, and most of the powers that are trying to rise also out of their own survival instinct have picked those models. Let us say India has adopted whatever model it has, China has also adopted. They have been successful powers largely, but they still, for their survival in fitness, they have adopted these models. I don't think anybody envisaged that this was going to be the permanent model for either of these countries. Which is the point. Once they have enough power, they are going to start asserting their own models also. For that, they need to develop their models, for which they need a theory of their own model. So you can call it a prediction, you can call it a natural progression. It's basically happening and is going to continue to happen. As part of that, is the Enlightenment ideal a culmination of human evolution really, or is it also facing challenges? Our societies are systems designed by it, inspired by the Enlightenment ideal, facing any challenges today, to the point that the model itself would be put to question. There have been, I mean, we can multiply examples, whether the European example, whether the American example. The way the model has been turned on its head is bringing the ideal itself to the question. Now, what it would lead to, we would have naturally two questions. Is the implementation of the ideal in a problem? Do we need to reinvent models? Or is the ideal deficient by itself? That's a valid question because no ideal has been so far permanent going by the evolution that we have seen so far. Right? I mean, the Roman Empire was there, then a lot of evolution had come in terms of how the slavery was overcome. There were societies that believed that enslaving other societies is the best way to optimize manpower for their own progress, which was eventually overcome because the natural craving in the leadership towards improved human condition. So all this is done in good faith, in the sense that the human condition was always sought to be improved, which was why slavery was overcome. The feudal age was also overcome. The post-industrial age is also seeking more improvement on the human condition than where we currently stand. So given that, it is in good faith that the current ideal is also going to be questioned. And who is going to question it? The West is going to question it in a very introspective way, but to the point that it undermines its own hegemony, it's not going to question it beyond a point. So the challenge has to come from elsewhere in a very theoretical way, which posits a better way of arriving at a improvement of human condition than what the Enlightenment ideal is being able to do so far.
So, Shankar, by the Enlightenment ideal, you mean those ideas of individual liberty represented above by rule of law,
which is the post-French ideal. So this basically lays a very good fertile ground for development of a post-enlightenment ideal. Then let's come back to Indian scenario. We are in a similar bucket in the sense that we have decolonized in 20th century, and then there has been a very long drawn attempt at rediscovering ourselves, which has gone some far, but it's a long way to go. But we, like others, have adopted what model we think is survival fit for now, which once again we have the reasonable power to assert ourselves. The craving for self-discovery has only grown. So now is when we are talking of what model can work better for us. But definitely we know that it's disconnected from what we have seen in tradition. We don't have kings like, Rama or Sagara or Yudhishthira, Vikramarka. Is it just about the model of monarchy versus principality, or these are all questions we will eventually discuss, but or is it about the character of the state, which is really the point that we have to discuss, because the character of state, how is it getting to be determined, and what is there a theoretical way to go about it, which is the main objective of our inquiry. So then we also know that is there really a state nation alignment that we currently have? Are our ethos really reflecting in the state ideal as it stands today? Which we know that there are arguments on both sides that in spirit it is there, in spirit it is not there. But whichever way it goes, obviously the de jure structure doesn't obviously reflect our ethos. And most of the ideals or the very perspective of the state takes towards individual, what is the nature of man, what does religion really mean, what is the denomination of a religion, what is society, how do you define backwardness or forwardness, What are human ideals in general? Most of these things are dominated by the Protestant ideal and the Enlightenment ideal as it has been adopted in 1915. But is it really what the nation has been craving? The will of the nation has been manifesting repeatedly through the electoral mandates, not just electoral mandates, protests, and in many forms. But does it really translate into a policy? And why does it not happen? Why does the best ideal of tolerance get digested into the most perverse form of discrimination when it enters the state policy? So, is it a systemic problem? Is it just because the system is corrupt, or is it that the way the system is designed that this is happening? Which is what really needs to be inquired into. So, even by this count, not just the world scenario, but also the Indian scenario, we arrive at this is the right fertile ground for theorizing a state, future state, in a way that the current problems or limitations don't exist. There can be again two ways to go about it. Can we solve these problems? Or do we have to design something where these problems don't appear in the first place so that it is futuristic enough? So, I mean, just going on the same line, in terms of alignment of state, what obviously what we have is a nation state and all that. This model has come in. Do we really have a alternative to it? And does it really make sense for us? So if we make this contrast probably makes it easy to go about thinking. Now, in a traditional scheme, as it shown on the left, there is an orthogonality of institutions of the state and the society, right? Where going by terminology, you can call it a Rajya versus a Desha. Desha being the geocultural unit, Rajya being the geopolitical unit. There is an orthogonality. You can always have the state spanning cultural units. You can always have cultural units also spanning, having multiple states if the states are small and weak. What this gives is there is a permanence to the cultural unit, which is always taken cognizance of by every political unit as an obligation. So every state policy, administrative policy, has to honor the regional culture. It doesn't matter who is the king. You have to go by the rule of the land, which makes all the difference. Now, why is it not a problem in a modern nation state? Is the modern nation states have been conceived in a geography where these have always aligned. The nation has always aligned to the state that was supposed to govern that nation, which is the case of the Europe, which worked there. It never worked in India because traditionally we have this separation of the geography by culture and by polity. Because for a long living civilization, we know that the political unit is always temporary. Right? Political units can expand, they can shrink, they can disappear, they can reform. It is a very volatile, polity is a very volatile thing, whereas culture is not. If we take culture to be permanent, the political unit has to be aligned to the cultural unit, not the other way around. Has this conception been brought into the Indian constitution? Is the one simple question that will help us answer whether this model is aligned to our nation or not. Right? Can this be done? Practically, the one objection could be that in the past, the very precise reason why we did not have a political union resulted in all the problems, right? The losses, subjugation, all those things. But does constituting a political union like that really need dismantling of these cultural units? It's not. It's just a way we administer things, the way the nation state is architected, or the way we architect the state by taking cognizance of the cultural units, thereby not making it a nation state in the first place. So now, this difference also, obviously, the if knowledge is there, it reflects in society. So if there was a Desha Raja orthogonality, how was it conceived in the first place, and how did it actually get translated into the root documents of the state, which is basically the for now, for convenience, we'll take the Smriti. We'll have other details later on. But if we draw a broad contrast between a traditional Smriti and a constitution, what's the kind of content it is in the first place? And how does it really reflect in the nature of the institutions we are building? So, epistemically, if we see, the Dharmashastra has different levels of content. One, it has ontology, it has prescriptive content, it has normative content, and more importantly, it is both refutable and modifiable. Whereas the constitution is not, right. Constitution is largely a prescriptive content. We start with the pronouncement of the doctrine or ideal of the state, which is not refutable by nature at all. So, what happens if you have to change it? There is no structured discourse in which it is debated and changed. Operational details can always be debated and changed. The root, the doctrine cannot be changed. The change of doctrine comes only with a violent revolution, which is the fundamental problem with all the modern systems, which was not really needed in traditional societies because there was always a refutability to the doctrine itself. Why is that? Because the doctrine itself is a derived content. Doctrine is not the root of the state document. And then layering of the text, how do we determine what is permanent and what is temporary? Again, what does constitution have? Does it have anything really permanent? It is just a pronouncement of what we are and how do we want to govern the country. Therefore, for these ideals, how are we going to design a state? That's what constitution contains. How did basic structure come about in our constitution? It was basically a exigency. We saw that it was getting mangled too much, so some protection was put in it. It's not really because it was a permanent principle. It was only and only because it was deemed to be an uncompromised principle in the current frame of time. Which is again, by contrast, we have three layers in any traditional text: the Sanatana, or what is eternal and doesn't change, because it is based on the permanent nature of man, nature of world, which don't change. And then there is a yuga or a temporal component, and then there is a deshakala or a time space, regional and situational component. This layering is what really makes the evolution possible, because on the anchor of the permanent we keep changing what is temporal without having to reform or throw away or revolutionize the system. So the forms can always be coming and going on the anchor of something permanent. In that sense, we go back to the previous slide. Even if we have to remove and replace the entire state machinery, it will still be possible by anchoring on the existing principles. And where does the law apply really? Is it confined to nation state? Obviously, the law of the land of the law are synonymous, right? Or geographically synonymous. Whereas in terms of applicability, law of the land comes as a subsequent part of, after having defined the ontology, we define the land where the law of land applies. Right? That's another, which is what really brings the orthogonality and makes it possible. Institutions of nation, obviously, whatever the society is not really emasculated or controlled by the state. So institutions of society are there, orthogonal to the institution of the state, which is not really the case in the modern constitution. Morality we can go in a bit later, but what is it really that the state is aiming at? So we have a rights framework which have to be protected by the state so that the individual liberty is protected, and then the state aims at welfare. The very major difference is the way we look at societies. In any nation state by definition is an organized entity, and it sees society as an organized entity too, which is really the main departure. Every traditional society sees itself as an inherited society, not as a organized entity, because organization is always costly, inheritance is cheap. There is a natural tendency to impart what you have, so inheritance comes very cheap, whether it is education or any other thing. Organization is inherently costly, it scales. Inheritance doesn't scale in space, inheritance scales in time. So, only when there is an ideal mix of organizing and inherited systems in a macro, in a complementary way, in a non conflicting way, it results in optimal results, sustainable as well as scaling. Obviously, in our current system, they are conflicting. The organized entity goes right against the inherited entity, is where the conflict is. So, to solve this, our macro itself needs to define in a way that these two become complementary. So, I think we have largely explained this thing. Do we really need to go into these things? Based on this, what is the difference between the Indian Union as we have today and the Rashtra, traditional Rashtra? By the way, Rashtra is not any neo Hindu slogan, basically, it is enshrined in the Shruti, so in our axiomatic sources. So, what is the goal of human life as it is defined? Right? Fulfillment seeking, or what's the highest that is possible? Versus what is the goal of a state? The modern unions should be welfare seeking. Okay. Institutionally, we will probably discuss more tomorrow, but let's say the whole conflict of identities, or it can be social conflict, religious conflict, or the conflict between individual purposes and the state purposes. Exactly where are all these conflicts arising from? They are arising from the way identities are seen by the state. Essentially, this is what makes all the difference in the two schemes. For instance, we go 100, 200 years back. Carnatic music, how did it come about? Right, it's Carnatic by name. Most of the renderings are done in Telugu, and the singers are predominantly Tamilians. How did this come about? Right? This came because the geocultural continuity always existed and enriched. Groups enriched each other. This stopped post British, primarily because the geocultural and the geopolitical was aligned. So now the Tamil state and the Tamil person are the same. They are geographically differentiated from the other person. So there is no cultural exchange, there is no cultural enrichment anymore. So, which is exactly how all the integration motives started becoming disintegration motives with the design of the nation state. Okay.
Shankara, that last point was important. Can you elaborate a little on that?
Which
Just for the benefit of everyone. The very last point that you mentioned. And the alignment of the identity.
So it's a, yeah, I mean, as I said, we'll probably, once we look at the institutional
We'll come back.
picture, it might be more, tomorrow we can go into more details, but primarily we can see the entire Indosphere in terms of three institutions, right? The Desha or the region, the Sampradaya or the tradition, and the Kula or the social unit. So these three Caste is what the Westerners understood, so that became our defining unit. The Desha went away, Sampradaya also went away. Sampradaya went away, and then a conglomerate called religion came in. Right? So, if an individual life has these three spheres, and these three institutions are operating as one matrix, they would work as an integration matrix, which did all the time before the nation state came about. Right? Whenever there is skew in one type of the institution, another took over. Let's say the region suffered, one region suffered. There is always one tradition that takes over from another region, inspires, and then there is some spread of new spirit in that region. Things happen that way, and over time, things there are ups and downs. Every region sees, every group sees, every tradition also sees. Tradition, in fact, has a much bigger life cycle, but traditions can go away also. New traditions come all the time. So this life cycle, everything put together is a living entity. No one of them can survive forever or scale forever. This balance could be kept because this matrix existed. This matrix is dismantled with the nation state, which is
Desa here means what? Rashtra or
Desha is just a cultural, geographic cultural unit. Like we have 56 deshas enlisted, right? The Anga, Vanga, Kalinga, Trilinga, Andhra, Odra, all these. In fact, these are the kind of conflicts we see in the nation state, right? I mean, the Vidarbha is unhappy under Maratha, Tulu is unhappy under Kannada, Trilinga is unhappy under Andhra, though both speak the same language, because there is a Desha difference.
So one desha can it was common to have for one desha to have multiple languages speaking people.
yeah, of course.
Always, that can happen, but Desha Bhasha is a typical idiom we use because each region has a predominant language.
Sorry. So one kingdom can have multiple languages. Is it possible? Like one
Depends. So region has Desha has a language.
correct. Yeah. Of
If
course.
the kingdom is big, it can have multiple deshas, but there is no one language that is officialized to oppress others.
No, this has happened in the past. For instance, until 13th century, the southern Maharashtra had some languages. But the advent of Sant Jnaneshwar and the power that Jnaneshwari wielded, the cultural, spiritual power that Jnaneshwari wielded, completely transformed the region, and Maharashtri Prakrit became more prominent, and the whole region changed in around 100 years into a Marathi speaking region. So the kingdom then had multiple languages. So always the Rashtrakuta kingdoms and the Chalukya kingdoms always had multiple languages. But the Chalukyan identity did not go away. So that's why you see the Telugu inscriptions of Chalukyas, the Maratha inscriptions of Chalukyas, and the Kannada inscriptions of Chalukyas, and then the Sanskrit inscriptions of Chalukyas are all there in the same region. So one of the reasons why no particular identity overruled was because of this matrix of identities. Because they had matrix of identity, nobody held on to one identity. So the conflict around one identity was less pronounced because everybody had to pursue orthogonally different identities.
So then, Shankara, you were saying how the nation state breaks this matrix.
Yes.
Can you continue?
Yeah, so nation state does not take cognizance of cultural unit in the first place. There are administrative units which are purely geopolitical. So where is the obligation on the nation state to administer a region according to the culture of that region, which is not in the constitution at all?
It's a design problem. Actually.
It is a design problem.
Fundamentally design.
Yeah. Some administrations may be better conscious and may be delivering, but the design of the state itself does not make it happen.
So which is why it's basically leading to again breakdown of the states into these units which are more closely aligned to the natural desha boundaries, right? The Telangana Andhra both because of this.
I was about to say that the cultural difference is what predominantly caused the separation. In the same language also.
So
The
the
original Madras state was the Desha, which a cultural continuity with multiple languages.
Madras state, so up to that point, most
There was
states,
a lot of assimilation and acceptance of the language and speaking of multiple languages.
yes, Madras state
Without
had
any-
many deshas, so and that happened. But once Madras state started becoming a political entity,
Right.
then the ossification comes and the other units have to go away.
Yeah, that is true, because if you look at the ancient Kalingan kingdoms, when they grew out of Orissa, they did never added Telangana. They only added the coastal Andhra and up until Kanchi. So there has always been some kind of a cultural continuity from Odra, Utkala, then Kalinga, Vishakhapatnam, coastal Andhra up until Kanchi. After that, there is no continuity. Whereas the linguistic state organized it differently.
So now coming to the challenges that we have seen so far in the exercise we have been trying to do. Number one, theorizing is very limited to the present known structures. We don't have a very good frame where we can contrast several theories, refute them, and things like that. Because most of these have been brought about by leaders, not by theorists. So there has never been a theoretical dismantling of any of these theories. So to bring them into a structured discourse is the first step for us to be able to do any research on these things.
Also, it's why is it irrefutable today? Is because that it is placed in the preamble. Let's say, anything in the preamble you cannot refute.
Directive.
That is one. Two, if it is a fundamental right, can you refute? Then that also we don't know, right? It is not just that X is refutable or not refutable. What is refutable and what is not refutable also is not clearly delineated in the conceptual organization of. Yeah, there is some informal. Why did the Supreme Court have to articulate a basic structure of the constitution? Because it found that okay, there was no thick line drawn as to what is refutable and what is not refutable. So now we have a thick line drawn in 1974 and not in 1950.
You cannot have an ideal disputable within the frame of constitution because you can replace the ideal only with a revolution.
Exactly,
is
that's the
no
fundamental point.
Structurally constitution cannot evolve into a new ideal based constitution because the base is changing.
This is an important discussion. This has happened in the Constituent Assembly debate. When they wanted certain things to be placed there, none other than Dr. Ambedkar himself said that no, if you place it there, then tomorrow another society will not be able to change it. So let us not place X in that space. So it's not that the CA debate was not cognizant of this complexity, but eventually what we have is what we have.